Good morning, everyone. Um, Morning, Erin. How are you today?
Well, how are you, Ardis?
Doing great. To all of you who are watching, welcome to In Your Element. This is our news edition, or at least our news episode today. So we're going to be covering what's happening in the higher education industry and also what's happening with some college universities. So we're going to focus on a specific theme, and we'll get started. Erin, what do you have in mind for today?
Well, today I have connected to the Great Resignation, and also the hurt that a lot of schools are feeling with low enrollments, and they just don't have the staff that they used to. Staff have moved on, and there's a catch-22 kind of situation where usually you would expect, enrollment goes up, so you have money to pay more staff, but most schools operate where they need that money in first rather than investing ahead of time and kind of planning for the future. And there was on our sister version of In Your Element, our podcast, one of the guests, Cliff Holcamp, he spoke about how colleges should be run more like tech companies. And
Yes.
I thought this fit right in your wheelhouse because you've been on the university side and you run a tech company.
Yeah.
So wanted to hear kind of your thoughts on that, and what would you do if more with your mindset that you have now went back, you were transported to a university?
Yeah, I mean, running a university is very, very tough, especially now. And if you don't have very deep pockets, or if you don't have an endowment. So those schools, as we're talking to funds and as we're talking to investors, one of the things that they're saying is that some of them are, for example, some of the larger endowments are doing very, very well this past year, and the returns are incredible. And then, the schools who are tuition driven, those declining enrollments have been going down. So it kind of shows a little bit about, the diversification. But when you're primarily tuition driven, it doesn't really help here. It's very hard to essentially make sure that you're reducing cost, and you got to understand how to reduce that cost, and it's very, very hard to do that in an institution or in education where a lot of your cost is going towards staff and faculty members, and it's kind of providing that providing that education to those students. So when a lot of your cost is there, then it becomes really hard to cut that cost down or to let go of people. But if you have the comparative, idea in kind of a startup, or perhaps even somewhere else, like usually you're right sizing, and then you're spending more on the growth component. So you're spending more on the marketing, you're spending more on admissions and recruiting, and you are then um, downsizing some of the other areas, because that's will fuel then the growth of that institution.
Can you say a little bit more about right sizing? That might be a newer term for our higher ed friends.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's been so many kind of written articles, and also there's even a documentary called Chair not a documentary, a new miniseries on Netflix called Chair. But essentially, the idea is that um, the old adage has been, if you build it, they will come in higher education. So the idea of building more programs and adding more programs, and you have a faculty member who has an idea, and then boom, you adding another program, but there's no students enrolled in those programs. So you essentially have dozens or hundreds of programs that are not, they're not there's no students who want to take them, or there is maybe just a very few, and then you have faculty members that are supporting those particular programs. So there is no revenue coming from those programs. There is no interest. And what do? I mean, you have to eliminate them. You have to make the hard decision to eliminate those programs and then stick with the ones that are in demand. So that's the right sizing, right? So finding where there's no demand and then removing them. It's very hard because a lot of faculty members are tenure faculty members, and it's really hard to do that. But we have to look we have to be very good about really trying to connect it back to that student, right? If the student doesn't want that, if the student doesn't need it, then why should they be paying for maintaining programs that there is no interest? And essentially, that's where their tuition money is going, right? I mean, in capitalism, there's this idea of maybe let's not go down that rabbit hole, but
Yeah. Yeah, no,
uh,
that makes a lot of sense. And if you're running an admissions team or marketing team at a university, the investment, so you have, say, somehow you're able to cut costs elsewhere, and
right.
you have this money. Where would a school ideally put it from like the marketing admissions side?
I mean, more outreach, more marketing, trying to reach a bigger audience, trying to have more of those conversations with them, trying to engage them more. You have to be on the digital platforms right now. So if you're not engaging with those students at the digital platforms, then you're just losing out, and that's going to perpetuate then the downward cycle of not being able to get to them, not being able to influence their decision, not being able to recruit them. And technology plays a really big role in that, right? So when we talk about investing or running like technology companies, we have dozens of different technologies, and we're a small startup, but we still use a lot of different technologies to kind of run our business. And we're able to change, and we're able to adopt and kind of move quickly because we need to be able to both recruit and kind of market, and also retain and make sure that our clients and our partners are really happy where they are. So it's the same thing on the other side, right? It's, you need to invest in recruiting those students, but also you need to invest in maintaining those students happy, and kind of retention is a big thing, right? So retention or persistence, however you want to call it. So you have to invest in that engagement. You have to invest in that high touch point. And it's not just the recruitment part, it's also the retention component. That's
Right.
a big part right now.
Right. All right, moving on to another topic. Colleges, I think there's this brain space where you think college, you think 4-year or 2-year. And schools themselves actually consider 6 years success as far as a graduation completion rate. And I think, people who work in higher ed might kind of know about this, but I would imagine it's pretty surprising to families and students that probably, I think it's 2/3 don't actually graduate in 4 years.
Yeah.
And the value of an education is the perceived value. It's part of the reason why people aren't enrolling as much. And how do you think this plays a role in that? If like the actual experience is 6 years versus 4, and that financial, burden or investment, you can think of it in different ways. What's kind of the school's responsibility to either, do they need to be more forthright that it's taking 6 years? Do they need to reimagine that speed to degree?
I mean, this is one of the topics, and it ties back to the debt that the students are going for. So you enter university with a promise that the average is going to be 4 years, right? And you're all set up for that. However, we all know that there is a lot of different circumstances where students cannot complete it in 4 years. There is an extra semester, there is maybe extra 2 semesters, three, depending on, if you have different life changes. But what happened? Who pays for those additional semesters? And that's really the question, is that you're entering and you're saying, okay, the baseline or the minimum price is going to be X. Oh, by the way, it can be as much as 100, 50% more of that, 150% of this, right? So is that communicated? How does that even get communicated at the admissions level when because everybody is going in thinking that they're going to finish in 4 years. So that's why different models are being popping up on the market quite a bit. And there is schools, for example, like the Rivet School, which is one of our partners, and a few others that are essentially programs that are helping recruit that student and also tying the completion of the degree and making sure that that student is prepared for that program, and making sure that they're kind of engaging and keeping that student engaged and kind of providing all the additional support so they're finishing the school in a specific amount of time. And the degree completion rates are 2-3 times higher than the traditional ones for that particular program if they are not being hand-holded throughout that. So there is two different components to this, right? There is how do you communicate to student that they're going to be in for a longer period of time, but then also how do institutions think about the cost, the cost structure of their education. Obviously, what typical get enrolled, you can take 12 credits or you can take 20 credits. You still cost the same, right? I looking at it from when I did my undergraduate work, I was part of a program where I could take up to 20 credits, and I was able to finish a bachelor's and a master's in 4 years, right? So I could take up to 20 credits, and then I could also take summer classes without that going towards my cost. So of course, what I did is I was filling out my semester, 20 credits a semester. But not everybody can do that, right? So most people are just going to take the 12 credits. So moving towards a paper credit or moving towards a non-traditional semester-based kind of program, I think a lot of schools are offering those options, but it should be more prevalent, and um, it will affect certainly how schools can predict their revenue, right? Because they can't predict their revenue now that they're getting it semester by semester or for the full year commitment. Now, if it becomes credit based, they have to be very good about predicting and making sure that that student is being kind of pushed along, and that's very hard to do, right? It's like now you need a whole arm of institution to make sure that that student is successful and they're coming back and enrolling over and over again.
Right, right. But it is kind of that trade-off between really serving the students and giving the flexibility they need versus if you don't do that, there's kind of an existential crisis going on at a lot of private schools because they, kind of didn't have to think about it that much. And it's just they're big organizations. It's hard to make big change.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're seeing it with large institutions and kind of some of the brands that are very popular, or they're very kind of schools, elite schools. They are now trying to get into online and providing a whole online method for students to take just courses rather than taking the whole degree and doing it online, because that's completely changed now, right? And obviously those models are becoming more and more popular, and that's becoming a core strategy of a lot of the branded schools. We're working with them. It's something that's in everybody's mind, right? And not in everybody's mind, but it's probably by this point in their strategic plan to kind of move programs online and become more what they call degree completion programs, or kind of credit based, and so on and so forth. So not the non-traditional 4-year student.
Right, right. All right. And our next article, continuing on the theme of not everything's okay at colleges. There's been a big push to collect data. And I know working at a university, a few of them, there's always that time of year where the research folks, they have to compile all the data to the various reporting agencies and accreditation. So there's tons of data, but what this article argues is that it's not necessarily translating into really understanding what the value of a degree is and how students can actually tap into that value. So there's one section that I thought was particularly interesting about, the kind of way that careers have changed. And a lot of these data models, they look at, okay, you're an architecture major, you're going to become an architect. But that is not how majors map to real life anymore. So we're looking at all this data, but we're not really at the end of what we're looking at. It doesn't match the world that we live in.
Correct. And we go back. This is exactly what we talked about the first article, where there's programs that are non-relevant anymore, right? But they're still there and they're still being funded. And for whatever reason, like students, they don't know and they think, okay, great, I'll take that program, or I'll take that program. What's the most popular program that anyone signs up when they enter college, Erin? Do you know?
I would say business is probably one of the most common. Is this a trick question? Do you know the answer?
It is a trick question. Yeah.
Okay. I don't know. Pre-med? No,
it's actually Undecided.
Oh, yes. That is a trick question. Yeah, I should have known that.
So there's the percentage of students entering college without knowing what program or degree they want to get is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's for a really good reason, because they can't necessarily see that degree to the thing that they want to do, right? So they also don't understand what that means. So this connection between outcome and degree has been getting wider and wider. And that's why non-traditional other training programs like boot camps and other non-traditional education have been accelerating, because they're able to provide the connection and they're able to show the value of that student right away. So it makes a lot of sense. So that's partly what we're talking in here.
Yeah.
And one other statistic, even though you get a degree and you finish up, the average time that somebody needs to go back and change their skill or reskill in the workplace, it's about 7 years right now. So that means that you finish a degree, you get into the job market, 5 to 7 years, you need to now go back and get more education, because that job has changed, or your employer requires you to upskill and kind of get more education, or it's essentially just, the job itself has changed. So every 7 years. Now, that's a large opportunity for colleges, universities to set up those programs in a way that somebody can come back in and they can just upskill and kind of change those careers very, very easily. We call it workforce development right now. There's a whole lot of different names to it, but kind of career changers. But 7 years, I mean, that's a great opportunity. So we've become essentially a society of long life learners, right? So education, the space is not getting any smaller. It's actually growing exponentially, the need for education. It's just that the models are not catching up with the demand.
Right. Which I think brings us back to thinking of universities as a different type of institution. Like
As a
you could say,
business.
yeah, as a business, which they are often criticized for, but the internal operations are still very much it's generalization, but a lot more of a kind of old school approach to running it.
I mean, they do get a lot of federal funding, and that's kind of dictates a lot of the policy
Yeah.
and how these institutions are run and kind of the standards that they're held to. Because on one side, they're trying to provide a public service, and then the other side, they're trying to, to make sure that they're running as a business. So how do you kind of match the two? Most of the time, a lot of these institutions are providing services and they're providing education to underrepresented populations. And um, if they don't have that federal funding, then it becomes really hard for them to provide additional support and to provide additional help. So that's why you're seeing the big divide right now, where the really um, successful universities with higher brands and kind of really kind of the brand recognitions, they are moving faster and they're attracting more students, whereas the ones providing education to underrepresented students and kind of populations, they're struggling, and that's why you're seeing the divide and kind of the expansion of everybody keeps talking about diversity in their classes, but it's a little bit different, right? Because if your school did not traditionally recruit like you can see it, for example, with some of the work, and maybe we didn't put that in here, but the UNC being on the hot seat for uh, being in the court for essentially saying that, hey, you're not recruiting enough Black students or underrepresented students, and that's traditionally been the case, but there's a lawsuit against them. But anyway, so the idea here is that you can't just change your institution, you can't just change the student profile, but the environment is changing very quickly. So it's very hard for schools to kind of catch up unless there is some government intervention there. And as we know, there's a few bills on the legislation right now that will provide. Obviously, one of the things that they're pushing for is tuition reimbursement for a lot of the community colleges. So that's one of the things that's in there. It will be a great thing for students in community colleges and kind of the populations that they're serving. However, that's only it's it's be bound to be cut, and only maybe for a couple of years or a few years going forward. So it starts with grand visions, but then kind of always narrows down, and it becomes always about the where's the funding coming from, right?
Right. And also, as we've seen in some of the technology hearings,
Yeah.
there's somewhat of a divide between some of our people in power and, like we were talking about, what the world looks like as far as jobs now. And there's just that lack of understanding. And so there's a lot of catch up all over the place. And
Exactly.
opportunity.
We don't want to, exactly. There's a lot of opportunity. So a lot of opportunity. Education is getting bigger. We just need to adopt to our expectations, to the students' expectations, or to that learner's expectations, and essentially steer in that direction. It's going to be hard to change, but it's necessary, and those who will are willing to invest in their people, in their programs, in the technology to kind of support those in their marketing and recruiting, like um, they'll be the ones who are going to be here for the next 5, 10, 20, 100 years, I guess.
Yeah, educational institutions are some of the oldest in the
Exactly.
world over time.
Yep.
So, all right. Well, thanks, Ardis.
Erin, always a
Yeah.
pleasure. Thanks for the
Yes.
very insightful and kind of summary questions. I think this worked out really well today.
Yeah, I've been watching the news a lot and picking up some tricks rather than
Excellent.
going back to school for journalism. Thought it was an easier
Training,
route.
training on the job. It's a thing now.
Exactly. It is. Yeah. You gotta do it. All right. Thank you all.
Have a good one, everybody. We'll see you on
Bye.
Monday.